Good morning, and thank everyone for being here. My name is Nadav Feldman, not Nadav.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I just joined. Do we already? If we already started?
No, we're just starting, and I'm giving you the first.
Also, again, just to thank you guys in COMEXI for the collaboration and the experts, both from Israel, Professor Yoav, Yair, and Hila Goldenberg, and the Mexican expert. I know that this is a busy time for you guys before the COP, and we really appreciate your participation. Again, this platform is very important, and it's, I think, one of the best in Mexico, if not the best. So thank you, guys.
Right. Thank you. And thank you to the, on behalf of COMEXI, to the Israel Embassy in Mexico City. So today we will talk about COP27, which will take place in a few weeks in Egypt. Israel, Mexico, and climate innovation. We have 4 speakers, 15 minutes each, to allow for another 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. A short, but still a short period of Q&A. Let me start by introducing Dr. Yoav Yair. Thank you very much. Good evening, as we were saying, in Israel. Israel, are you in Tel Aviv?
Actually, I went home already. I'm in Kfar Saba, which is just east of Tel Aviv.
All right. Okay. Well, Dr. Yair obtained his PhD at the Department of Geophysics and Planetary Sciences at the Tel Aviv University, and is since 2014 Dean of the School of Sustainability and the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya. How do you pronounce it?
Herzliya, but we got the approval from the Ministry of Education, and now we are called Reichman University.
Reichman. I saw also. I wasn't sure. Okay, the Reichman University, where you are dean of this School of Sustainability.
Correct.
Right. Okay. He has a long and distinguished trajectory working for Tel Aviv University and the Open University of Israel, and is member of the editorial boards of Eureka, Rosh Gadol, National Geographic Science Advisor, and is editor-in-chief at the Open Atmospheric Science Journal. He has published widely on remote sensing of clouds and precipitation in relation to lightning activity, planetary lightning, thunderstorms, space-based observations of global lightning activity, and many other topics that are beyond my reach. Welcome very much. Thank you very much, and I welcome you. Why don't you take the floor?
Thank you very much for having me, and good morning, friends in Mexico. I will share my screen and give you a 15-minute review of what used to be, until last week, a 45-minute review, but Nadav sent me an email saying that we're going to divide the show, and so I squeezed it real hard and tried to come up with what I call a question and a possible answer, which I posit before you. And of course, the startup nation can be more than just Israel, and probably a Mexican-Israeli collaboration can fit right in. So let me jump right into the talk and just note that you and many other countries in the world, and Israel and the Middle East specifically, already feel the power or destructiveness of climate change. This is from the latest IPCC report. Climate change is already affecting every region on Earth in multiple ways. The changes we experience will increase with further warming. That's already, I wouldn't say a forecast, but a prediction. And sadly, it's going to materialize quickly in our lifetime. You know this, stating when and how the temperature of the planet rose from the beginning of the 18th century, or the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution. And you can see that most of the time, average temperatures of the planet compared to the 1951, 1980 average was slightly cooler. But since the 1980s, and I'm sure you know that as well, we see a gradual increase in temperature, and the 21st century certainly the first and second decades of this century are the warmest ever. And even if we go back and do climate reconstruction, all the way back 800,000 years ago, we do not see such a high temperature and such a high level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is, of course, a result of our industrial way of life, the way we produce energy, food, drive, fly, and do everything which is reliant heavily on fossil fuels. As a result, the atmosphere gets warmer. Planet had warmed by more than 1.1 degree on a global average, which results in a melting of ice in the poles. We know that, we see that very clearly in Greenland, in Antarctica, in Iceland, and the water expands when the temperature rises, leading to a sea level rise, which I'm sure you know and you measure in your own country, in the Pacific Ocean, in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic, and certainly in the Mediterranean Sea bordering on Israel and our neighbors. So the pace is now 3.2 millimeters per year, but expected to increase in the coming decades. Natural disasters are becoming, I would say, not a surprise anymore. They are reported. This is the statistics of 2020, which was a record breaker in terms of both temperature and frequency of natural disasters, and the insured amount of damages as a result of floods, tropical storms, hurricane in the Atlantic and typhoons in the Pacific, wildfires, most notably in California, but also in the regions of Central Europe, Germany, Turkey, Italy, even in Belgium, and certainly Spain and Portugal, but also in Mexico and other countries in Latin America. We see this convergence of major natural disasters, which caused, in 2020, the insured damages were more than $200 billion, just the insured damages. And of course, we measure it by very anthropogenic or anthropocentric way. I'm not mentioning the damages caused to biodiversity, to woods, to forests, to marshlands, to fish in the oceans, to coral reefs. We don't put a price tag on that, but we should. We should, because this is what's happening and will affect us. And just a slide from Greece a year ago, this is 2021, when the tourist season was severely disrupted by fires that threatened the health and security of tourists and locals. And I was, by the way, in Athens when there was a fire in a forest not so far from the city, and you could smell it. You cannot avoid it, and it affects the health of people and of small children and elderly people, and certainly affects the economy. So this is something that we see and we fear will increase in the coming years. The brand of hurricanes and typhoons, this is from Hurricane Ida that struck Texas and South Carolina and Louisiana, in a matter of hours, a total damage of $20 billion in a matter of hours. So, and you know it, the Yucatan Peninsula is often hit by these types of storms. And Mexico has the dubious luck of getting storms from both oceans, both from the Pacific and from the Atlantic sometimes. And that's going to increase in the future. All our models predict it. Now let's zoom in a little bit on our part of the planet, and this is the Mediterranean basin stretching from Portugal all the way to Aviv, Israel, and Jordan, of course, Egypt, all the Mediterranean basin countries. We experience a rapid warming compared to other places on Earth. You can see this graph. Basically, the green line is the rest of the planet, similar to the graph I already showed, and the blue line is the Mediterranean region. And you can see that we have been warming faster and stronger compared to the rest of the planet. And the Middle East, specifically within the Mediterranean basin, is called a climate change spot. So it's a game of words, it's a wordplay, but it is hot, and it's a spot, and hundreds of millions of people live in that particular region of the planet. And this immediately affects the availability of water, which of course affects agriculture, food, security, nutrition, and the well-being of people in the region. This is what we call the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And you can see the brownish color is where the total net of how much rain falls and how much water evaporates from the surface gives us a negative balance. Certainly, if you look at the Middle East and the Levant, especially southern Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, and of course, Israel. And let me remind you, Egypt totally relies on the Nile River. Syria relies on the Euphrates River, and everyone depends on the annual amount of rain. And when this decreases, severe problems arise. And already a reason, say, for that. Climate migrants, we see that in Africa, desperately trying to escape the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Eritrea, Darfur, and Sudan, but also in other countries in Chad, Mali, Morocco. Those guys are trying to cross the Mediterranean. On the other hand, it's much easier for terrorist groups to recruit those desperate people, offering them livelihood, food, and so you have Boko Haram in Nigeria, you have Daesh in Syria and in Iraq. And this is amazing. That's only going to exacerbate when climate change kicks in more strongly in our region. Now, the future depends on us. I know that, you know that. I told it this morning to my new students. My freshman student just started orientation week at my university, and I told them, you are the hope, you are the future. You can change the course of what now appears almost an inevitable destiny. But RCP is just a nickname we choose in physics, say how hot it's going to get. And this is a CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, and it tells us how hotter it will get. 1.5 degrees, the Paris Agreement, 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, or 5, God forbid, 6 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. Future depends on the will and the politics and the economy of the nations involved. This is from a local report prepared by the Israeli Met Service. The Israeli Meteorological Service ran a computer model with 2 scenarios, the 4.5, which seems to be a little bit realistic, 8.5, which is, I call the Donald Trump wet dream of, don't care at all about fossil fuels, just burn it. So in both scenarios, Israel gets drier. The upper graph shows the relative amount of precipitation. And let me remind you, for those who have not visited my country, we are bordering on the desert. We are just 200 kilometers away from the desert strip, which includes Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the Sahara Desert. We are very sensitive to any small movement of the pressure systems, and this will change due to global warming. So we will expect 25% less rain in the coming years. And I'm not going to talk about, 2100, end of the century. I won't be here. No one will be here from the audience, right? But I'm talking about 10 years from now. And the temperature will rise accordingly by more than 1.8, maybe even 2 degrees on top of the 1.5 that we have already warmed. So for Israel and our neighbors, be them Palestinians, Jordanian, Egyptian, Lebanese, of course, the outer belt, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Sudan will be affected severely as well. So this has major consequences to the national security of Israel. Let me say, regional instability is already affecting many of our countries that we have joint borders with. For example, about food riots that happened in Syria a couple of years ago, which the Assad regime slaughtered people who made demonstration against food prices. The same goes for Egypt and other countries. So water and food will be a resource that nations may be going to war on. The scarcity of the availability of these resources will affect politics and, by inference, the national security of the country. Of course, if you look at it from a military standpoint, the fact that it's getting hotter and drier restricts the way you can use your army. But that's a different side issue I'm not going to delve into. But the Ministry of Security finally realized that the national security of the country is directly affected by local climate change. And civilian disasters, that's already occurring. And you can see on the right hand an F-16 in one of our Air Force bases, which was completely flooded a year ago, and we lost 5 F-16 fighter jets. And this is the central of Nahariya, a northern city in Israel. So these events, which used to be extremely rare, are now what we call the new normal. We get them twice, 3 times, 4 times every year. We had one yesterday in a small neighborhood of Jerusalem, and that's going to be exacerbated by climate change, mostly because Israel is one of the densest and most urban countries on the planet. 93% of the Israeli population lives in cities. So we are not Mexico City size in terms of urban density, but we are getting very close to that in the coming decades, because Israel is one of the countries which has the higher reproduction rate in the OECD countries, 3.1 children per woman. And the increasing temperature and the dryness leads to aridity, as you have seen, and this creates fires, dust storms, and as I said, migration and destabilization of the local neighborhood. So what shall we do? Israel, as you know, prides itself for being an innovation and startup nation DNA that can possibly lead in many areas that are crucial solving the climate crisis. We have the 17 SDGs. You know that the degree program, what I teach at my university, the courses are addressing each and every one of those 17 SDGs, but we have a rationale and the know-how and indeed the enthusiasm and finally the government support to tackle problems of those 17 SDGs: hunger, water, sanitation, climate, biodiversity, everything, urbanism, what have you. Israel is now gearing up. I should confess, a little bit late, I would say a decade late, and I'm going to be fashionably not politically correct and say that it was the previous governments in Israel that neglected this aspect. But we have the force and motivation now to try and tackle climate change. This is a website which I highly recommend you to visit. It's called Planetech. It's kind of an umbrella organization that maps and fosters innovation in many areas in Israel, and you will hear Hila on a specific domain. This is Planetech, and this is from another website which is called Climate Startup Nation Central. And again, this mapping of the 700 Israeli startups in the domains related to climate tech. So you can see a lot of money is being invested. There are a couple of investment trajectories, both from the government, from the Innovation Authority, which used to be called the privileged, the leading scientist, the chief scientist of the ministry. Now it's called the Innovation Authority, and startup companies using what you probably know, various mechanisms such as greenhouse or what we call accelerators and hubs to foster innovation, give the seed money to new companies and push them with mentorship into the first round, at least, to be able to recruit money. You can see some names in manufacturing, SDG 12, circularity, construction, carbon and nature tech. Israel wants to be one of the leading nations in carbon capture, nature-based solution, mobility. So these are the names of the companies. Alternative foods, Hila will talk about this shortly. Water, Israel has been for a long period, from the 60s and 70s, a leader in water infrastructure, cleaning and desalination, and climate and smart agriculture. So we are all over the place. I admit, a little bit late in the game, but still, this DNA, this enormous bank of talents graduating from Israeli universities and going into the industry, and the ability to get money, come up with ideas, and run quickly. I have strong hopes in Israeli startup companies, and this is just a map from the report published this year, and then we have a new report by Planet Tech, and you can see where are the relative strength of Israel. I think alternative protein is number 4, but probably will climb faster, as Hila will explain. So we are all over the place, traditionally more strong in agriculture and energy and transportation and water, but we are catching up real quick, and I have high hopes that we can join forces with any partner, certainly with Mexico and other countries, and tap into this innovation spirit, this huge resource of educated young entrepreneurs, and save us from the impending disaster. So let me sum up and say the trends we see in climate change in the Mediterranean basin are irreversible for the foreseeable future. We will not get ice ages shortly, and we will not be cooler like we used to be. But we have to be prepared. And so adaptation plans need to be put in place from the municipal level to the government level to the regional level. And this is, by the way, one asset that Israel is now employing and will showcase at the COP27. Climate diplomacy in our region can be a really powerful mechanism to foster the achievement of SDG 17, partnerships, and global peace. And as I said, the last bullet, innovation and investments are crucial. So we need money, we need patience from investors, unlike in other domains that they are sometimes eager to get real fast return on investment. We will be able to solve and help nations fix the climate problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Yoav Yair, for this synthetic and very interesting. I was wondering why the Middle East is heating up faster than the rest of the world, but that comes in the questions and answers period. I will now introduce to you Leonardo Beltrán. He is a distinguished visiting fellow at Columbia University Center for Global Energy Policy, and non-resident fellow at the Institute of the Americas, an executive fellow of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, who is a North American fellow. He's on the board of Sustainable Energy for All, and is currently also a member of the advisory board of the Just Transition Initiative, a partnership between climate investment funds and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, another think tank in Washington. As Deputy Secretary of Energy, which he was from 2012 to 2018, Mr. Beltrán was in charge of designing Mexico's national energy strategy, which was the policy document supporting the big and very important energy reform of 2013 in Mexico. He is leading expert in the energy transition and has been named several times as one of the most influential leaders in the energy sector in Mexico and Personality of the Year in Renewable Energy. He holds a master's in public administration in international development from the Kennedy School at Harvard and a BA in economics from ITAM, the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de Mexico. Thank you for being with us this morning, Professor Beltrán, and the floor is all yours.
Thanks very much, Celia. It's a pleasure for me to be here and share the floor with such a distinguished audience. I have prepared this presentation, but certainly, given what we heard from Professor Yair, this is, basically in line with what I wanted to share. And let's start with what's happening in Mexico. And in Mexico, greenhouse gas emissions by sector, this is the latest report that we have from the electric sector. This is an official report published by the Mexican Department of Energy. And basically, 2/3 of every ton of emissions comes from the energy sector. You can see here the shares. We can go over all of them, but the main message here is that energy, it's the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Then how is that composed, these sector emissions? Well, basically it's on the energy industry, it's half of that, which means manufacture of fuels, solid and other fuels, refining, and certainly production of heat and electricity. And then the rest of the industries like manufacturing and construction, transport, and other sectors. But, half of the sector emissions comes from the sector in particular, so generation, extraction, production, and the like. This is the latest nationally determined contribution. Probably I will defer this to Enrique, who would speak a little bit later about that, I guess. But the bottom line here is that we have committed unconditionally. So we will do all our best efforts to comply with this nationally determined contribution, and that implies to reduce 22% our greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 with these different shares. So 1/6 coming from transport, 1/3 coming from power generation, 1/6 coming from residential and commercial, and you can see there the rest of the contributions towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions in our nationally determined contribution. This is already reflected into our legal framework. So this is why it's unconditional, because it's a national commitment. And we already have the general law on climate change, which reflects the uptake of this nationally determined contribution. And certainly there are different acts that support and precondition the level of engagement and the level of commitment that we have for the General Act on Climate Change. For the power sector, there's the industrial or Electricity Industry Act, which states the need that we have for the power sector. But my main message here is just to say that as a country, we already have the legal instruments, we already have the commitments made, and certainly this is supported by the general public. Now, that's on the formal side. So where are we now? And you see, this is a graph of how are we faring in terms of clean generation. Clean generation is supposed to be one of the main opportunities, not only to advance the energy sector, but also to contribute to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as we can see here, we are not on track to actually meeting our commitments. And this is, an official document. So in terms of the ambition, we have the ambition. We have already reflected that, but that's not corresponding to the advancement that we have been observing in the power sector. And basically, there are a couple of elements that have been preventing the advancement of these particular sectors. Certainly, different efforts to reduce permitting and to improve the operation of the national utility, which in the end certainly is not contributing to advancing the power sector. And the other is to limit the investments in clean generation. So on both sides, on both accounts, there are not enough resources to actually meet the targets. And there's a clear policy to stop the opportunities open for private investment to the expense of the general public in order to try to improve the national utility, which in the end, this is the result of those particular processes on permitting and on attractiveness to the energy sector. Now, in this same report, as you can see here, and probably it looks a little bit distorted, but in terms of the power generation that the government is envisioning to have by 2035, it basically continues to have business as usual, improving or advancing combined cycle. There's even coal there, a larger share of coal, which would not contribute to clean generation targets, nor our nationally determined contribution. But I just wanted to highlight this is, the official outlook of the energy sector, despite of having all the different components aligned to make sure that we comply with our international commitments. And this final graph shows you a little bit of how we are in terms of meeting the greenhouse gas emission target. Certainly, we are below what we are supposed to have. So, in terms of mitigation, we would be falling short of the expected commitment that we have already made under the UNFCCC framework, and not only under the UNFCCC framework, but national. That's where we are in terms of climate change in Mexico. Now, taking advantage of Professor Yair's comments, I wanted to highlight a couple of opportunities for COP27 for Mexico and Israel. And certainly there would be a focus on two items at COP at least. I would like to highlight these two couple because one, it's on decarbonization. And in decarbonization is how to reduce or eliminate greenhouse gas emissions in the hardest to abate sectors. oil and gas, steel, and cement. So big industries with plenty of opportunities. It's both, the three of them are global in nature, and there's an opportunity for developing specific technologies, both in Mexico and in Israel. And you know, here you can see a couple of items on oil and gas. For instance, reduce and eliminate methane leaks, gas flaring and venting. Improve energy efficiency, which, you know, because of the scarcity of resources in Israel, Israel has been very advanced in improving energy efficiency. And certainly carbon capture, use and storage, which was one of the sectors that were highlighted by Professor Yair. There's an opportunity there to reduce the environmental footprint of the oil and gas sector. So that's an area of opportunity for COP27 and certainly for Mexico and Israel to collaborate on. Steel and cement, certainly, because you know, the future of mankind, certainly with all these different displacements, lie on developing more resilient cities. And steel and cement would be needed if we are to decarbonize, you know, these eventual new cities. So that's why the role of technology to decarbonize these sectors are one of the key areas of opportunity to work in tandem, Israel and Mexico. And the last part, which Professor Yair also mentioned, it's on agriculture, and certainly there's a need there, but let me focus on fertilizers. Fertilizers would be one of the key areas to develop green fertilizers to support affordable, safe, and low carbon agricultural sector because of precisely these different items in terms of droughts or in terms of you know, these floodings that would destroy the you know, the living standards and the availability of resources for different communities. So if we are to develop a more resilient system, we really need to have fertilizers that would, green fertilizers that would support these displaced people, but also more resilient future. And on energy, certainly, you know, the idea would be to scale up new energy systems and technologies, certainly renewable energy, but we need to focus on a set of enabling technologies. And those would be batteries for storage, smart grids to connect different regions, electrolyzers if we are to develop hydrogen, and certainly green hydrogen. And, you know, last but not least, certainly financing mechanisms to accelerate the energy transition. So, you know, these ideas that you have in mind to support the startup nation, there's plenty of opportunity to engage with Mexico, also with different startups and different ecosystems focused on certain technologies. But there's also a role for national policies and the relationship with global policies in sectors that would be suffering from the greatest loss and damage, which would be, again, another of the key topics for this COP, the role of loss and damage. And that's where, you know, new financing mechanisms and new national policies with partners alike would be a great opportunity to take advantage of this focus. And with that, let me give back the floor to you, Celia, and thanks very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Leonardo, for being just in time. We thank Leonardo Beltrán, a distinguished COMEXI member, for focusing on the Mexican case, the COP27, the possibilities of Israel and Mexico collaboration, and identifying 3-4 areas where we should or could focus to get something out. Let me now introduce Hila Goldenberg. Here you are. How are you? Welcome to this seminar, to this webinar. Hila Goldenberg is the Good Food Institute International Collaboration Manager. The GFI, the Good Food Institute, is an international science-based non-profit organization focused on building a sustainable, healthy, and just food system. I see food systems is a major issue here. We may want to concentrate. GFI Israel partners with scientific institutions, governmental organizations, think tanks, businesses to promote alternative protein research and innovation in order to accelerate the global food systems transition to alternative proteins. Hila Goldenberg background combines experience in investment banking and business experience in the food and biotech industries. For the past 13 years, she has led international cross-cultural strategic collaboration in various sectors, mainly in Asia and Europe, but she's now in Latin America and the Middle East. Well, she holds a BA in Business and East Asian Studies from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Welcome, Hila. We are ready to listen to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm very excited to be here today and very excited to share with you the story of Israeli innovation in alternative proteins. I would like to thank you, our wonderful Mexican hosts. And I would like to also thank Nadav and the Israeli Embassy in Mexico for their collaboration and for the opportunity. In this short session, I'll try to answer some interesting questions, like what are alternative proteins and how do they address some of the world's most burning climate sustainability and food security concerns? What's unique about Israel in this aspect, and how come Israel drives such a disproportionate part of the innovation in alternative proteins? And what makes it the world's leading hub for innovation in this field? So this graph here is where it all begins. People love eating meat. We all love eating meat. It's part of our culture, family heritage, social habits. And that's the way it's been throughout human evolution for something like 12,000 years. And we can see here that meat consumption today is the highest it has ever been. And it is expected to double by 2050 compared to what it used to be in 2005. And as you already know, by that time, there are going to be 10 billion mouths to feed on our tiny planet. And it's not just that, while the growth in population is expected to be by 60%, demand for meat is expected to grow by 120% over the same period of time. The main reason for this is that most of this growth in population will happen in low and middle income countries, where meat consumption per capita is steadily rising as a result of social mobility trends, and the large population are becoming wealthier and gaining access to meat. And this heat map, for example, shows the expected growth in demand for poultry meat by 2030. And alongside other countries, we can see Mexico here on the left in red. So as we saw in Professor Ariel's presentation, we are living in a very challenging time for our planet. In recent years, humanity has begun to realize that we cannot continue producing food, producing protein the way we do. What worked for the past 12,000 years just doesn't scale anymore where we're at now. And the challenges to our planet, to humanity, and to the global food system are just too many. Global livestock is responsible for 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Some estimates say 14.5 to 20%. That's these are the numbers usually, which is more than the entire transportation sector in the world. It's the first user of freshwater resources on the planet. It's the #1 cause for deforestation. This industry takes 75% of agricultural lands. It causes massive land and water pollution. And it's also a major factor for public health risks in two aspects. First is antibiotic-resistant disease caused by extensive use of antibiotics. And second is zoonotic viruses. It's all those viruses that can be transferred from the animals to us humans and cause pandemics. And it's not just COVID. We had the swine flu and avian flu and all of these. It's important to note that conventional animal protein industry is not only a driver of climate change and a contributor to all those risks, but it is also very vulnerable to its effects. And this was demonstrated also during the COVID pandemic with the exposure of these fragile supply chains. Animal agriculture is also very inefficient, and it's an inefficient way to use our planet's resources for producing food. We basically use precious agricultural land to grow crops that could be fed to humans, but instead we cycle these crops through animals, just in a very inefficient and wasteful way, just so that we could eventually eat part of their meat. For example, let's look at the chicken here. This is basically the most efficient one of all three animals in the slide, but in order to get 1 calorie out of a chicken, we need to invest 9 calories in. And the animals digest these calories. This could be grains or pulses or whatever the chicken eats, and they use the calories to survive and breathe and walk and build their bones and all the parts that we don't even eat. And this conversion ratio is even worse for other types of meat, as we can see for pigs and cows here at the bottom. So how do we feed 10 billion people by 2050 without lighting the planet on fire? By that time, we are going to have a 56% food production gap. And we know today that it will be scientifically impossible to meet the Paris goals to keep climate change below 1.5 degrees Celsius unless industrial meat production goes down. And this will only happen if we give consumers around the world a replacement that they're happy with in terms of price and taste and experience and accessibility. And this is basically the theory of change behind our activity at GFI. We are not going to convince consumers to change their diets in the same way that we're not going to convince the world to consume less energy or drive less. What we need to do is to have the industry produce the meat that people want, but in a way that does not have all these harmful outcomes. Sorry. So if we want to create products that taste, cook, and feel like the products that we all know and love, first, we would need to learn and analyze these familiar products. For example, the meat's natural biological structure, the composition, the physical properties. We would need to learn things like what makes it juicy, what makes that fiber texture, what composes the sensory experience of eating meat that we enjoy so much, and then use advanced scientific methods to recreate that using innovative technology. So we divide the field into 3 segments. I will not tell you all about it here, but you're welcome to log into our website at gfi.org or gfi.org.il, and there are a lot of resources about the technologies, but I will basically tell you that we divide them, the 3 segments, to plant-based ingredients, products produced using microorganisms via fermentation, and those are mostly used as additives and ingredients to these products, and cultivated meat, maybe the most famous technology of all 3, produced from actual animal cells that grow outside of the animal's body in a bioreactor. Before we continue, I know Celia already told you a little bit about our organization, but I will tell you a little bit more. So we are indeed a science-based non-profit organization, and we work globally to accelerate innovation in the alternative protein space. We have nearly 160 employees globally in 5 regions that were selected very strategically, as you can see in the map, around the large consumer markets, the US, South America, India, Europe, Asia Pacific, and an office dedicated entirely to tiny Israel. And you will soon see why. We work with the scientific community. We offer scientific advisory to companies. We teach an academic course on alternative proteins in universities, and we fund open access research. We work with the business sector, from forming innovation strategies for the largest food corporates all the way to supporting entrepreneurs throughout the entire life cycle of their ventures. And we also work with governments, promoting national plans and food strategies, and working with government offices to ensure supportive policies and regulations for this entire sector. So as I mentioned, a food system which much greater reliance on alternative proteins has the potential to sustainably feed our planet, and by that, address 9 out of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And when compared to conventional meat, alternative proteins dramatically reduce emissions. They require far less land, eliminate the need for antibiotics in our food system, and feed more people with fewer resources. If we look into cultivated meat, for example, in the longer term, as the science and technology of cultivated meat advances and achieves commercial viability, we can even achieve even larger emission reduction. There's a life cycle assessment that was recently published that modeled the impacts of a production plant producing cultivated meat in 2030. When the production is done in a space powered with electricity from clean energy sources, the footprint of how meat is made really changes very dramatically. As you can see here, it shows that compared with conventional meat that is also made using renewable energy, meat that is cultivated from cells can cause up to 92% less global warming, 93% less pollution, and use up to 95% less land and 83% less water. Yeah, so gladly, alongside all the environmental benefits that we just mentioned, there is also a significant economic opportunity here. It is estimated that alternative proteins will reach 10% of the global meat market by 2030. That's less than a decade for this market to be worth $140 billion. And by 2035, some sources predict a market size of $370 billion. Different forecasts give us slightly different numbers, but they all predict a very significant market size for alternative proteins. And countries worldwide have already started to identify the potential of investing in this field for all the various motivations that we've just mentioned. And they're providing research grants, providing agricultural resources, supporting the construction of production facilities, and promoting regulatory pathways for these products to reach the market. I did not mention that a lot of these products are considered novel food, and this is why they would need to have their own regulatory systems. In the past couple of years, this field has been booming, and it gained massive interest of the world's largest funders. And in 2021, alternative protein startups raised over $5 billion of investments in venture capital. Israel has paved the way as a global leader in this field, and while technological investments in the country saw an 18% drop in the first half of 2022, investments in Israeli alternative protein startups saw 160% yearly growth. We can see very steadily for the past 2 years that Israel ranks second in the world, just after the US, in alternative protein investments. And consider Israel's size when you look at these numbers. Israeli startups in this field have raised 18% of total global investments, and that's more than all European countries combined. As far as academia goes, academic research is a key driver of innovation in this field. More than 50% of the funding in Israel went to commercialized academic research. The science of alternative proteins is very interdisciplinary. It can go from food engineering to biotech and tissue engineering and plant science. And we have over 30 labs in Israel which are active in the field of alternative proteins. And this is a relatively high number when comparing to other countries. And you need to consider that this is a very nascent technological field. And Israel's leadership is, we can say very confidently that it starts in academia. These are the 55 alternative protein startups that Israel has across these 3 technological segments. You can see here they are in different levels of maturity. We have 14 cultivated meat companies that we can see here. None of them is in the market, but they are getting closer. Super Meat, Future Meat, and other farms were among the first in the world in this field and are working on their pilot and scale-up. Fermentation, we have 17 companies. Here we can see a variety of startups. Most of them are in development stage. We can see companies from Chunk that develop whole-cut meat analogs to Kinoko that develop a unique product based on mycelium, on fungus, and the Remilk and Imagine Dairy that focus on dairy proteins that are produced using microorganisms. In the plant-based category, there are 24 startups, and in this field, we have quite a lot of startups that are already in the market. We have ingredients such as chickpea and InnovaPro who focus on chickpea protein, but also Redefined Meat who focus on 3D printed plant-based meat. They've recently launched, and now I think they're selling in about 3,000 restaurants. We have Yo that develop plant-based eggs, and Plant Tissue develop plant-based salmon, and a lot of others. Again, you can see all of these on our reports that we publish on our websites. I can share it with you afterwards in the chat if you wish. And what's even more interesting is that we know of about 30 additional early stage startups that are still in the pipeline under the radar, and we expect to see them join this list within the next couple of years. And alongside the startups, there's also 9 incubators and accelerators that operate in Israel. Some of them are supported by the government and backed by large corporates as well. So speaking of corporates, the Israeli industry is also very much involved. Here are just a few examples of some of the largest food manufacturing companies in Israel that are operating in the field. The partnership between Nestle Israel and the Israeli startup Future Meat that make a cultivated meat, CBC Group, which is Coca-Cola Israel, and Wilk, an alternative protein cultivated milk startup. Tnuva, Israel's largest food manufacturer, created a joint venture with a stem cell company and many others. When it comes to government, we see a lot of support for the field from the Israeli government. Earlier this year, the Israel Innovation Authority approved the world's largest cultivated meat consortium, bringing together 10 academic labs and 10 companies to perform joint R&D. Alternative proteins are a central part of Israel's value proposition for global climate change and food security efforts. And it is very present in the diplomatic and the multilateral discourse. Here in this picture, you can see Israel's Independence Day celebration in the United Nations headquarters in New York that we did earlier this year with the ambassador that was fully dedicated to alternative proteins. And just a few weeks ago, Israel has declared the food tech and the field of alternative proteins as one of the top 5 national R&D priorities for the next 5 years. And these are just examples. So we've reached the end, but to sum things up, the world will not get to net zero emissions without addressing food and land. And alternative proteins are a key aspect of how we do that. The transition will require governments to invest in every decarbonization tool available. And towards COP27, we are happy to see more focus and attention dedicated to food. And now is the time to manage climate risks, collaborate, and work on a global transition to a sustainable, secure, and just food system. Thank you.
Thank you, Hila. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I would love to try the cultivated meat, how it tastes. I haven't seen it yet.
You can do it only in Singapore. You will have to go there to try it commercially.
I have to go to Singapore. No, it sounds very, very interesting. Okay, let me rush a bit and introduce Enrique Lendo, another fine and distinguished member of COMEXI. Thank you for joining us, Enrique. And he's an economist from the Monterrey Institute of Technology, the Tec de Monterrey, as we call it, with a master's in public affairs from Indiana University. Over the past 20 years, he has worked in the areas of environment, climate change, international cooperation, and sustainable development for governments, private sector companies, and international organizations. He's currently the Sustainable Finance Coordinator at the United Nations Environmental Program in Mexico, helping to build capacities of governments and private financial institutions to manage climate risk and mobilize assets to finance sustainable projects. From 2007 to 2018, quite a long time, he was Deputy Minister of International Affairs at Semarnat, in charge of advancing Mexican interest in international organizations and conventions. He does that for us, like the Paris Climate Agreement, the 2030 Agenda, and the SDGs, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the G20, and the more recently the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, the USMCA. Thank you for being here, Enrique, and please, we listen to you.
Thank you. Sorry, because something happened here. sorry about that. And thank you very much, Celia, and congratulations to Hila, Leonardo, Yoav for their presentations. I have not too much room to add, but I'll try to give you a few points on the general context. There's COP27 and the main points that will be discussed, also where we're coming from for this meeting. This was pretty much addressed by Professor Yair. The temperature has been increasing, and that is shown in the lower chart. It has increased 1.2 degrees since the Industrial Revolution, and that has been due to greenhouse gas emissions. And for that, we see the upper right graph, and we see the historical emissions from different countries and regions, starting with the European Union, all the way through the Industrial Revolution, and then the US, and then we have the emerging economies. And what we end up with is a very high concentration, a very steep jump, as you can see in the upper right, in the upper left, sorry, graph, on concentrations of part per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it is undeniable the climate is increasing, and every single lab and scientist can tell you about that, and that is due to human impacts, due to human influences, which are greenhouse gas emissions. And we've been engaged in the international agenda within the United Nations and some other fora to address this problem for the past 20 years. In 1924, for instance, the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change entered into force. That was the first agreement that we had. And a few years later, we approved a protocol in order to implement the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to reduce emissions. Back then, the science wasn't advanced enough to tell us how much we needed to reduce emissions and where does temperature increase needed to be stabilized. But by 2015, by the time we signed Paris, the science had advanced far enough to let us know that temperature should be stabilized below 2 degrees Celsius, the increase of temperature, and preferably 1.5. So that's the main goal of the Paris Agreement that we adopted in 2015. And in order to reach that goal, the science told us that emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, should be decreased at least 45% by 2030 and be net zero by 2050. That means that by 2050, every single ton of emission that we release to the atmosphere should be captured either by forests or re-injected into the soil. How do we do that? And the way we proposed it in Paris was through national targets, through an instrument called National Determined Contributions. That means that every single one of the 195 countries that approved the Paris Agreement should submit every 5 years their climate change plans or national determined contributions, stating the emission reduction target that the country will undertake for that period. And that should be updated every 5 years. In Paris, there was also a global goal on adaptation, although that goal was not quantitative, and there were some agreements on financing. There were agreements on forests, and there were some agreements on other instruments like the carbon markets that would help bring the emissions down. Probably one of the main challenges to implement the Paris Agreement is the cost. According to many estimations, including the OECD, the IMF, the latest one came from McKinsey. It takes a lot of money to reduce that level of emissions. Remember that by 2050, we need to pretty much neutralize emissions. So the amount calculated by this latest estimate of McKinsey is about $275 trillion by 2050 to reach that level of emissions. And that implies an investment of about $9.2 trillion a year. That includes investment in energy that it's already taking place, but also at least $3.5 to $4 trillion of new investment in renewable energies and the clean air energies that Leonardo talked about. There's also an assessment of how much it will cost us to adapt to climate change, particularly in developing countries, and the figures come up to the $300 billion by 2030 and about $500 billion by 2050. We don't have much time. I mean, we have so much parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere that if we want to reach the levels that we committed in Paris, which is 1.5, the remaining budget that we have in order to reach that goal will pretty much run out in about 11 years. If we want to reach that 1.5, 32 years, and that's mid of the century, if we want to approach more to the 2 Celsius, and 32 years if we want to get into the 2 Celsius degrees. So that has, of course, started to worry not only citizens and governments, but also capital markets and companies. The inaction of governments of not meeting the goals and delaying actions has sent very, very worrying signals to different communities around the world. And since 2020, the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report has tabled climate risk and environmental risk at the top of the tables. And Dr. Yair was also talking about the economic impacts from this. But if we look at the figures in the bottom of this slide, the Swiss Re, which is the second largest insurance in the world, estimates a 50% impact in the GDP by climate change. In 2050, the World Meteorological Organization concludes that $33.4 trillion have been spent in climate change impact events between 1970 and 2019. And in Mexico, those figures are not different since we're a vulnerable country. The capital markets are recognizing more and more that climate change is a risk. So what we see is an evolution in all assets in all types of acids labeled as sustainable climate and environmental. We have seen rates of growth on these acids of twice, and in some of them 3 times as much in the past 3 years. So who is emitting all these gases that are affecting the atmosphere and producing climate change nowadays? The main emissions are concentrated in only 4 parties. 3 of them are countries, and the other one is a region. And about 80% of the emissions are concentrated in 20 countries, the so-called G20, in which Mexico participates. And this was mentioned by Leonardo, but most of the problem lies on the energy sector, which accounts for about 75% of the emissions, and then the agriculture, forestry, and land use change, which is about 20% of the problem. But if we look at historical emissions, we see a different trend. While China and India are the countries in which the emissions have been growing the most for the past 40 to 50 years, looking at the issue from a historical perspective, we realize that the countries that have contributed the most are the United States and thus in Europe. So the main challenge in the negotiations is to balance the development priorities of those countries in which emissions have been growing the most for the past 40, 50 years with the development priorities in which they have to pull out still hundreds of millions of people from poverty. This is like an update of the countries that have updated the national climate plan. As we mentioned, those are called NDCs, and we don't see a lot of progress. To be honest, only 23 countries, for instance, updated their 23 countries out of 197 updated their national climate change plans with higher ambition, meaning that they will reduce more than the previous NDC they presented in 2015. So where does that take us? The assessment that we did before COP26, I'm sorry, last year, tell us that the temperature would increase 2.7% at that level of ambition. So if we want to hit that 1.5 goal that we established in Paris, the emission reduction targets should be updated and increased by at least twice and even 2.5 times the current level that we have now. For options that the World Energy Agency recommends in order to reach that target, the first one is clean energy, and they estimate that clean energy should double or almost double by 2030. Energy intensity should be reduced by 35%. Methane emissions, and Hila was talking about this, a lot of those come from the food sector, should be reduced by at least 75%, and investment in advanced technology, speaking of innovation, which is the topic of this webinar, should be almost triple in order to present and improve all the technologies that we have nowadays on energy production and also energy efficiency. We have COP26 in November last year. It was a very important COP, and with some relevant agreements. probably the two or three most important of them is the commitment of the countries, which was ratified, on reaching that 1.5 target by the temperature increase by the end of the century, and also some other issues that will come up in COP27. One of them is a potential agreement on loss of and damages, and of course all the financing needed in order to address that issue of loss and damages for developing and vulnerable countries, and also for innovation and other policies that need to be improved in order to reach the targets that we established in Paris. After COP26, the situation improved. We went from that perspective of 2.7 down to around 1.9 to 2.4, according to different estimates. But there's questions everywhere that maybe the commitments that different countries presented in Glasgow and before are not being presented adequately. There's still lack of transparency and lack of calculations within those commitments. So that is going to have to be improved in the next years. The situation remains very risky if we think about vulnerability of different regions and countries. We see that Africa and Latin America, the Middle East are probably going to be the most impacted regions in the planet, and then also certain countries. We have, of course, there Mexico and also Israel among the most affected from climate change. These are probably the four most important issues that are going to be addressed at COP27. We talk about the issue of loss and damages, where a potential financial goal will be set, and also a work program. The international community is also urging all the countries to update their NDCs. Leonardo showed you some of the perspective for the NDC of Mexico. It has not been updated, so we're hoping that this would be a venue in which the NDC could be updated, or at least if it is not in this November, it could be next year. And an adaptation goal ratify, and also doubling the finance directed to adaptation. And then in terms of mitigation and some other instruments besides the one we decide within the United Nations, like all the development from private investment, and how is that linked to the goals that we are deciding within this government forum, are going to help bring us to the emission reduction targets that we have both in 2030 and 2050. So this is my last slide, and of course I'm at your service for any question, and also in this email. Thank you very much again, Celia. ¿Estás mutada, Celia?
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Enrique Lendo, for this very broad outlook of what is going on. What will happen, or what will be the priorities in the G27? Where are we? Where did we leave in the G26? If I may just read to you, you may have seen them, some of the questions that from the public. The alternative meat, Hila, is just many people are interested and are asking how long will it take to have cultivated meat at affordable prices? Or it just sounds so interesting. That's one. The other, yeah, okay.
Should I answer now?
Yeah, if you want.
Okay, so there was a report produced by a Boston Consulting Group, I think it was late last year, with some forecasts. Basically, as a GFI, we don't deal with forecasts so much, but according to that report, cultivated meat will be available and will basically reach what we call price parity to conventional meat by 2032. This is according to only one source, but I agree with this estimate more or less. And as for plant-based meat, this would be much sooner. The R&D cycles are shorter. The path to market is shorter. There's no regulatory issues, so this is expected to reach price parity, I think, even next year.
Okay, thank you. There's another question, very interesting one, regarding legislation in nuclear batteries. Is there investment and legislation regarding nuclear batteries? MIT has proposed this technology, says Jessica Tornell. Can anybody say something about this legislation on nuclear batteries?
What I can say about nuclear, it's there are small modular reactors that are right now very hot in this sector. There are several companies already developing this technology in the US, and there's a focus on actually deploying this with the help of the International Atomic Energy Agency and certainly the nuclear regulator in the US. So in terms of research and development, I think the focus right now it is on SMRs, but certainly there continues to be different lines of research, and probably if you are interested, I would point you to both the International Atomic Energy Agency. They do have a program focused on Latin America, if you are interested, and the Nuclear Energy Agency of the OECD, which basically is on the forefront of research at the OECD.
And perhaps the last question. People in the audience are worried about how exactly will climate change affect Mexico in the next 10 to 15 years. I think you already addressed this issue, but you may want to say a last word on that. Where is Mexico in this global panorama regarding climate change?
Sure, Celia. Well, I already put there a reference where you can actually see different scenarios of what would be the impact of climate change for Central and South America, which includes Mexico. Bottom line is that in the regions where there are droughts in Mexico, it would be drier, and where there are rain, it would be a lot of rain, but in very short periods of time. So that would disrupt productivity of the land, and that would imply, for instance, in terms of yearly uptake of rain, probably a reduction of around 22% in the worst case scenario. If temperature rises beyond the 1.6 degrees envisioned, all the way up to 4 degrees envisioned. In terms of productivity of the land, so how effective we are, similar to the calculus that Hila mentioned regarding, poultry. Most probably in our region, we would see a reduction of around 20 to 25% of land productivity. And that has a huge effect for agriculture, for even services like tourism and the like, which in coastal cities would have a strong effect into the population, but also in terms of habitability in those regions. So there would be larger amounts of displacements, like the ones that Professor Yair mentioned in the Middle East, but also here in Mexico and Central America. And probably, these dynamics you have already started to watch from Central America, particularly from Haiti. You have already been observing a flock of Haitians coming to Mexico, but this is not the only case. This is periodically happening because, again, as my colleagues already mentioned, Mexico has this unique position where everything that comes from the Pacific flows through Mexico, and everything that comes from the Atlantic coast also through Mexico. So it's like the perfect storm where we are located.
I see Enrique Lendo has his hand raised. Would you like to say something and close, Enrique?
No, yeah. Maybe complement a little bit on the on that perspective that Leonardo correctly pointed out on the scenarios. There's both a physical scenario projection, and I think that I'm not going to elaborate on more on that, but we have also estimated the cost from those different scenarios, for instance, the one we have after 2050, the scenarios go from half of the GDP impact to 5 times the GDP impact, depending on the scenarios that we have of increase of temperature. And we have also estimated the economic impacts for certain cities, the largest cities in Mexico. We have estimates for Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey, and those have a shorter perspective. So in those 3 cities, due to different impacts, especially water scarcity, heat waves, and the health impacts from heat waves, the impacts also on infrastructure from climate change, floods, and also heat. Go up to from 1.5 to $5 billion in the next 8 to 10 years. So one thing is vaguely stating what is going to happen in the country in terms of physical impact, but the other part is how much that is going to cost to Mexico, both to citizens, but also to the government and to the different companies that are located here.
Thank you very much, Enrique. So thank you to all of you for your participation. Have a nice day. Thank you very much.